We're going to make a version of a wire cuff bracelet, but we're going to have a cabochon stone setting that's going to be replaceable. And for this piece, you want the base to be at least 1 millimeter thick, and I'll show you why in a minute. And you want your base plate to be at least 6 millimeters longer on either end than the stone. That is the part that's necessary to make this a replaceable piece. Now, for your bezel, I'm using sterling silver for the base. For the bezel, I'm using fine silver because it's so much easier to work. And figuring your bezel setting, rule of thumb is 1/3 the height of the stone. So this is 9 millimeters high. The bezel needs to be 3. I've already got some pre-cut bezel wire. This is 3 millimeters high by 0.3 thick. I would suggest 0.5 because it's a little more substantial. So we're going to use 0.5 fine silver for our bezel, and we know already that it needs to be 3 millimeters high. We need to know roughly the length, and the way to do that is with an oval stone is measure the width and the length, add those two together, divide by 2, take that size, add the thickness of your sheet, 0.5, and multiply by 3.14, and that will actually get you within a millimeter of the correct length. Then we'll take that piece, anneal it, and just wrap it around the stone and check it for the correct size. I've set my calipers at 3 mil, and I just hooked one edge on the metal. I'll zoom in so you can see. I hooked the top edge over the metal, and I just drag the other edge down the length, and that'll give me a nice fine line all the way around, all the way down to cut to. So this is way too long, but we'll get there. Light your torch, create a neutral flame, and because this is fine silver, we're going to heat it for about 5 seconds. That should be all it takes. Quench it in water. Now, using fine silver, it's very workable. Malleable is the word. It's got a bit of a curve because I used my bench shear to cut it. But if you just pull it in your fingers, you can actually pull it straight. Yeah. So now we're going to figure out the rough length, cut it, and wrap it around our stone. So I did my calculation, my width plus my length divided by 2, add 0.5, multiply by 3.14, and I came up with 71.74 for this one. So 72. You can cut your bezel with sharp shears. Just make sure they're sharp. And then place your stone on your bench plate or something that's nice and flat. And we're going to start in the middle of the side to wrap our wire around. So just hold the wire against your stone and push it around with your other fingers. Now make sure that you hold the wire in the bottom. You don't want it folding in. Make sure it's straight up and down. And you can see that that's about a millimeter long. So trim a little bit, trim a little bit until you have a fairly perfect fit. And I'm just using the shears to trim, but make sure you cut it 90 degrees. Okay, this is a nice fit, and what we're going to do now is bend, push, pull, do whatever we need to do to get a perfect join. As perfect as possible. And you don't have to keep the shape of the stone. At this point, we're just worried about getting as perfect a fit as possible with these two ends. Hold this in your third hand, joint up, and we're going to flex that and put one piece of hard solder so that it touches both sides of the join. Just a small amount of flex right on the join is really all you need. Pick up your solder with your flex brush, place it on the join. The reason you pick it up with the flex brush is so that the solder is flexed. Now we're going to light our torch. And Smith's mini torch, LPG and Oxy. LPG about 100 mil long, Oxy just until the orange goes out. And we're going to just brush the flame off and on. We only want the flame to hit the joint, so you can see that I'm coming from the bottom up so that I'm only touching the joint, not the bottom. So bring it up to temperature, flux will go clear, the solder will flow, and you're finished. Quench it at this point, and we'll check for fit. Dry your bezel off after you've taken it out of the water, and you're going to just push it over the stone with your fingers, and you need to be able to push the stone all the way through with just a gentle push. And because you're using fine silver, when you do that, that will give you the perfect shape of the stone and it'll hold it. But what you need to do now is check to see that it's flat. This one isn't. With fine silver, oftentimes you can just push with your fingers. It'll bend enough to make it flat. If there's still a little bit of a gap, you take your sandpaper, and we're using 400 grade paper. Just put it on a flat surface, hold your fingers on top of the bezel, and run it back and forth until it's flat. And you should be able to see a dull sanded area all the way around. So it should look exactly the same. So just keep sanding until you get that. Don't worry about the top, don't worry about the outside at this point. Okay, we're ready to put this on our base and solder it. So what we do is we go back around our stone, make sure that it still fits, because you'll oftentimes change the shape when you're sanding it. So push it in and out a couple of times, make sure you have it perfect. Now we're going to just sit that on top of our base, flex the inside, put soldered chips all the way around, and I normally have 2 millimeter long bits of solder with a 2 millimeter gap, another solder, another gap, and I do that all the way around. I know it sounds like a lot of solder, but you never have to worry about having a little gap in the outside when you're done. Put your base plate on your bench plate just to make sure it's flat. If it's flat at this point, put your bezel on. Have a really good look, make sure there are no big gaps. Sort this out now. So I just gently hold the bezel, run my flex brush around the inside. As long as you have flux touching the base and the bezel is all you need. Put your solder chips in. I use solder snippers, and it's quite easy to just cut them in place. Now, you're going to use your wet flux brush and push these around. And we're using the brush again for the same reason, that we want all of the solder bits to be fluxed. It's a little bit tedious, but it pays off in the long run. So just keep spreading them out, pushing them with your flux brush until you get it ready to solder. If some of them get caught up in the brush, just twirl your brush with it touching the base and they'll come out. This is what it should look like. So now we're going to put this on a screen and solder it. So I have this set up on a tripod, and I'm going to heat from underneath the screen. I'm using a number 7 tip on my mini torch, and what we're going to do is just gently heat this from underneath, on and off, until the flux dries out. And we'll know when the flux dries out because it'll be a crusty white color. So we don't want it to bubble too much like that, or it's going to push all of our solder chips away from the bezel. So once it gets this crusty white, what you can do is keep it warm, and you can use your solder pick to push the bits of solder back in place. Now we don't want to get it too warm or the solder will flow, and we don't want it to flow until we've got all of the bits back touching both the base and the bezel. Okay, so now that's all good, and we're just going to circle the bottom right underneath where the bezel is sitting. The flux will go clear, and shortly after that the solder will flow. We're using hard solder again. So there it goes, and you just have a look and make sure it's flowed all the way around, which this has. Now let it cool for a couple of seconds, quench it, and pickle it. The reason I heat from underneath is when solder flows, it'll always go to the hottest part of the metal, and if you're heating up here and your little thin bezel wire is hotter than the base, which it normally is, the solder more often than not will jump up the side. So heating it from the bottom, it ensures that the solder stays where it's supposed to be. What I forgot to tell you was, when you're using a screen, make sure there's nothing on the screen that's going to melt onto the back of the bezel. This has had enamel on it, and I just shifted over to a point that didn't have anything on it. Make sure it's clean. Take your piece out of the pickle, dry it, and have a really good look at the join between the base and the bottom. It should be a perfectly formed little curve. There shouldn't be any gaps in it whatsoever. And if there are, now's the time to fix it. Now, at this point, we're going to take a 4mm mandrel, put it on the end, on either end, and we're going to trace around it with a fine point texture.